Hi, everyone, and welcome to Streaming Hits and Misses. Today, we're going to go through a lot of really interesting streaming data from our recent report, Streaming Hits and Misses. I'm Jimmy Doyle. I'm the Director of Film and Television at Luminate. And then I'm joined by Tyler Aquilina, who is the media analyst who authored this report. And it's fantastic. There's a lot of really interesting insights that we're going to get into today.
Thank you.
And if you have any questions as we're going through, please feel free to drop those into the Q&A. If we have time, we'll get to them on the call, but if not, we'll get back to you and answer those after the webinar. So let's get into it. So we're going to start with a macro overview of the streaming landscape. So what we're seeing here is the global subscriber growth for a lot of the SVOD services. There are some that are left out that we'll get into in a moment why they're left out there. But what we're seeing here is a slowing growth year over year or across the last few quarters for pretty much all of these streamers that are listed here. One big thing, there are some companies that aren't reporting traditional subscriber data that we'll talk about in a second, but one of the big pieces of news is that Netflix won't be reporting their subscriber numbers coming soon in 2025. What's the impact of that, and why is that kind of so significant in the streaming landscape?
Well, it's mainly significant for Netflix. They obviously started out their business by regularly reporting, like, we have this many streaming subscribers, and just reporting consistent growth for that, quarter after quarter, until, of course, the infamous Q1 of 2022 when subscriber growth reversed for the first time, and that's what led to this kind of major correction in the streaming market where their stock plummeted, and there was kind of a reassessment of how the industry was looking at success in streaming. Previously it had been based mainly on subscriber growth over time. After Netflix reported those numbers, there was a shift to looking at, well, we should be really more considering, top line financial metrics like revenue and profitability. Now Netflix really is out so far ahead of everyone else on those financial metrics, and they have been for a long time, just because of pretty much based on their large subscriber base. They have a worldwide user base much, much larger than the rest of the major U.S. SVOD services. So that has allowed them to, possess this kind of financial largesse that the other streaming companies don't really have. And now they're saying, well, we want investors to be focusing on those metrics rather than our subscriber numbers, in part because those subscriber numbers, which have been growing, in contrast to the rest of the streaming field, still pretty quickly, and, by fairly large, at least relatively speaking, numbers over like quarter to quarter, that's going to slow down because it's been largely driven by the password sharing crackdown that they started a couple years ago, where they're enforcing, like, you can't share your password across all these different outside, like, one account per person basically is their rule now, and that's brought in a lot of new subscribers who may not previously have been paying for the service. That growth is going to slow down because there's only so many new subscribers you can bring in through that method. And I think Netflix really does not want its fate to be tied to subscriber growth anymore. Like, they don't want investors to be looking at, oh, the subscriber growth is slowing down, and then panicking because of that, which has happened in the past, as we just talked about. Now they really want their financial metrics to be guiding their performance on Wall Street, and I think that's a big part of why they're not going to be reporting subscribers anymore.
Right. Is that something you expect to happen for any of the other streamers, or is this really specific to Netflix because they're so big? And
yeah, definitely the latter. Like, it's definitely specific to Netflix. I think these other companies need wins, that, or at least what they can position as wins with investors, however they can get it. And growing their subscriber totals is a big part of that. I mean, not all of these services are growing their bases consistently quarter to quarter anymore. Some of them have seen dips or even reversals in growth over between quarters, but even so, like, when they post a big quarter of subscriber gains, that can be a big win for them, especially because their financial metrics are not nearly as strong as Netflix, and so they need something that they can point to be like, we're doing a good job.
Right. So we're missing a few streamers here that I mentioned. We're missing Apple and Amazon here. Why is it that we're not seeing those there, and what's kind of significant about the way that they report their data.
Yeah, well, Amazon and Apple have never reported subscriber numbers for their streaming services. Prime Video and Apple TV Plus are always excluded from this data that you're seeing here because of that. We just don't have any official numbers on how they're doing subscriber-wise, or really even financially. They don't report any like top-line financial metrics for how their services are doing either. And the reason for that is they have no incentive to do so. I mean, these are huge tech companies that are involved in so many other businesses, rather than these media companies where streaming is really becoming like the key cornerstone of their business. Like often in reporting on Apple and Amazon's streaming operations, you'll see their streaming business described as like a rounding error to them, because like they just make so much revenue that whatever they're losing on streaming is really, not impacting their bottom line as much as it's impacting, say, Disney's bottom line.
And this is just a piece of the puzzle for them.
Yes,
for
exactly
a larger
right.
subscriber business, with Amazon having obviously the Prime business, which is for most people about free shipping or Whole Foods more than it is about Prime Video.
Yeah, absolutely. Like Prime Video is a part of Amazon's business. Like, and really, like, I think most of the people who are coming to Prime, Prime Video is a nice cherry on top of that, but they're coming for the free shipping and all of that stuff. So it really, disclosing subscriber numbers that could make them look bad, especially for Apple TV Plus. I mean, whatever, we've seen some estimates of their, subscriber numbers. I don't know them off the top of my head, nor would I really want to cite them because, who knows how accurate those are. But if you're just looking at like how their content has performed viewership wise, it's clear that their subscriber base is not large.
Right. Because they're performing more similar, it depends on the show, and they've had some really big hits, but when we look at their performance, it's probably more similar to something like a Paramount in terms of what we're seeing.
Definitely.
And
like you said, they've had like a few hits. Like their content does not break out regularly on these charts.
Right. It's not that consistency that we're going to see later with Netflix when we go through that data. So as we're talking about profitability, and that's really where a lot of these streamers are moving, this is a chart that's really explaining where are they at with profitability today.
Yeah.
Can you explain this a little bit?
Yeah. So as you can see here with the color key, so the pink columns represent the revenue that the streaming, or what they call the direct-to-consumer segments of these companies, are earning. Mm-hmm. Most of the traditional media companies break out their streaming business as like its own segment in their earnings report, so you can see very specifically how much money the streaming business is taking in or losing, and losing in most cases. And then the purple column shows the expenses, that these companies are spending on their streaming businesses, and then the yellow is how much profit or lack thereof those segments are generating in the first half of 2024. Now, you can see here that obviously Netflix is profitable, has been profitable, at least on paper for a while. Disney now, for the first time this year, posted a very small but still significantly a profit for its streaming business. Mm-hmm. So Disney has now successfully gotten its streaming business, which includes Disney Plus, Hulu, and ESPN Plus, into the black, which none of the other traditional media companies have managed yet. I will note one little nuance that's very interesting. Warner Brothers Discovery groups HBO, including like the linear HBO business, together with its streaming business in its reports, which makes those numbers a little bit wonky. You can see that they've cut their loss pretty significantly from what it has been over the last couple of years, but just their accounting of that, again, includes linear HBO, which is still, a significant business. So it's hard to say, like, just how much their streaming business is generating in profit, at least with regard to Max specifically.
Right, and people who are subscribing to HBO are getting that Max piece. So
yes.
I get why they're including it there, but it complicates the matter because HBO is a mature business.
Yes, absolutely.
As far as these go, Disney, they're posting that small profit on streaming. All these legacy companies, though, have this profitable but declining business in linear, though. How is that affecting these numbers and how these companies are kind of looking at it that way?
Well, I mean, like you said, so linear TV, in contrast to what some people might think, is still very much a profitable business. There's a lot of ad money to be had there, even as, the subscriber revenues are dropping because of cord cutting, people leaving the what they call the cable TV or pay TV bundle, those businesses are still making money. It's far down from what it used to be, but it's still profitable in contrast to streaming, which is where more and more people are going. It's a growing business, but it's not profitable yet for most companies. And really, the implications of that are that a lot of these companies are going to be smaller in some ways from what they have been in the past, just because streaming, I don't think, is going to be able to replace the scale of those linear TV revenues anytime soon. Streaming is growing, but it's not growing as fast as it needs to make up what is going to be lost from linear TV.
Right. That's interesting, which I think pre-pandemic, maybe when a lot of these companies were getting into streaming, that was sort of the idea, is maybe this can replace this linear revenue that we can look out and say this is going to go away.
Yeah, I mean, that was the hope, and also they didn't really have a choice, because that's where the audience has been migrating. And, certainly, again, I think that streaming will become more and more profitable over time, A, from, more people migrating there, and B, from, an influx of more ad dollars. All of these services have ad tiers now, except for Apple TV Plus, but there's been rumors for a while that they're considering launching an advertising tier. I would be very surprised if they didn't do that in the next couple of years, just because ad revenues are make up a significant portion of the revenues that these services are generating. I think Netflix has said that the average revenue per user for someone on their ad-supported tier is already higher than someone on the ad-free tier.
Wow.
Yeah, which is very significant, because that ad tier is not very old. They've only been in that business for a couple of years, not even 2 years actually. I think we're coming up on just the 2-year anniversary of that launch, and the ad loads in terms of how many ads are playing during ad breaks on that service are still pretty small. And those will increase over time. More and more advertisers will shift more money into the streaming business. But again, that's going to take time. And the linear TV business, it's pretty clear at this point, is eroding faster than streaming is growing to make up those dollars.
Right. And as premium SVOD moves more toward that advertising model, or at least some mix with that advertising model, that's something where that viewership becomes so much more important, right?
Yes, absolutely. You need time spent on an ad-supported service to generate ad revenue, right? Because if not, your ads aren't reaching anybody. So yeah, it really, you're seeing these companies trying to now grow their engagement in any way they can. The streaming wars, or what we called the streaming wars, were really driven by this idea of subscriber growth, like we were talking about. Now we're in this phase where it's much more about how can you keep people on the service, and how long can you keep them on the service. And, I think I've started calling them the engagement wars. And I think that's why you've seen now Netflix talk a lot more about our main competitor is YouTube. They are much more focused on who are our rivals for people's time. And they're realizing that includes, platforms outside of just these other subscription video on demand services. Right.
Interesting. So as far as trying to get more people engaged with your platform, one way the streamers are doing that is through bundling.
Right.
So we've seen some big bundles this year come out. Of course, we've got Disney. It's Disney, Hulu, and Max is a really big, very kind of public level one. Can you walk us through what we're seeing here in terms of this consumer demand for bundles, right?
Yeah. So this was a consumer survey that was done where it was asking streaming users which services they would prefer to be included in a hypothetical streaming bundle. Like if you were able to build your own bundle of all the major services, what would you want in there? Unsurprisingly, Netflix was far and away the top service, desired for inclusion in there. More than 80% of those surveyed, you can see, wanted it in there. Prime Video was in a fairly distant second. I mean, 65% compared to over 80%. So that's what we're looking at here, is just preferences for what consumers would want.
As far as these streamers are looking to find kind of new bundles out there and find new ways to lock arms and try to survive the streaming wars, or what remains of the streaming wars here, who needs it most as far as that kind of bundling piece?
You're talking about which services need it the most?
Yeah, which services really probably would benefit from being part of a bundle?
Right. I mean, there's really no other way to say it. The services that are being used the least on their own. Services like Paramount Plus and Peacock, and arguably Apple TV Plus as well would really benefit from being included in a bundle where, you're paying for the service as part of a package deal with other services that you might use more. And the thinking is that, well, if you're paying for it that way, that and getting a service that you wouldn't pay for on its own, that might entice you to actually use it, check it out, what's on there, and maybe get into the habit of using it over time. That's
Right.
what these companies are hoping for.
And that's even with Apple, pretty recent news, not quite a bundle like a traditional, like you're going to save money on this bundle, but they're moving into the Prime channel ecosystem that way.
Yeah. And that's an interesting development. I mean, kind of hand in hand with bundles, which is not always talked about as much, is what I call streaming aggregation.
Right.
It's platforms like Prime Video channels. YouTube has what I think it calls primetime channels. Like you can buy certain services or a subscription to certain services through YouTube's
Right.
platform.
And you're buying those services for pretty much the full price, but
Yes.
within YouTube or Roku or
Right, yes.
Amazon or Apple is doing some of that.
Yeah, Apple has its own platform for that as well. And and yes, you're right. You are paying like the full retail rate for the service, but what's different about that is the platform that you're buying the subscription through, like Amazon or Roku or whatever, is getting a cut of the subscription revenue for selling you the service, basically.
Right. So that's a pretty significant thing for Apple to decide, we need the broader distribution of Prime
Yeah.
to distribute Apple.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, it's not it's not like a paradigm shifting thing, but
Right.
it is like an admission by Apple of like, yeah, we need help here, and we are perhaps not going to be like the ultimate power player in like the streaming aggregation business.
Right. So everybody wants Netflix to be part of a bundle. Of course, it's like it's the big streamer right now. Is that something they would really do? They have a small kind of half bundle right now that it's not really accessible to a lot of people.
Yeah, so what you're talking about there is Comcast's Stream Saver bundle,
Yeah.
I believe it's called. So you get Netflix, Apple TV Plus, and I think Peacock through that. Which the interesting thing about that is anyone who subscribes to Comcast Internet, like there you can get Peacock already, like as like a promotional offer through that, included with like your Comcast subscription. So Peacock there isn't even really sweetening the deal for a lot of people. It's really Netflix and Apple TV Plus that are adding to that, but that is only available to Comcast customers. So it's a small segment of the population that is even eligible to get
Right.
that, unless you're willing to switch your internet or cable provider to Comcast, which I think the barrier for that is pretty high for a lot of people.
And we wouldn't expect Netflix to do a true sign up on their website for a bundle with other streamers.
No, they have no incentive to do that. I mean, they're so far ahead of everybody else. Like the advantage of that kind of an arrangement would be only for whatever services are partnering with Netflix. Like Netflix would be giving up some amount of subscriber revenue through, presumably whatever kind of revenue sharing agreement they'd be striking to make that kind of a deal. And so it would not really benefit them to do that.
Right. So another big story this year, especially post-strike, has been the volume of content and the shifting of that. We're seeing the amount of original series on SVOD for the first half of the year go down pretty significantly from 2023 to 2024.
Yeah.
I guess the kind of unfortunate question is, have we reached the bottom here? Is there more to go in terms of original series output? Or?
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to predict. I think Film LA just put out a report saying that like on location filming in Los Angeles is like the worst it's ever been
Right.
so far this year. I do think that we have hit the bottom in that we're still feeling the repercussions of the strike-related production shutdowns, and so production will, I think, start to ramp back up over the next couple of years. Not the caveat there is not to the peak TV levels that we saw. I discussed this in another report that we did with Luminate. It was called "The Death of Peak TV." Looking at the end of this kind of boom era for TV production. Kind of in the midst of the streaming wars, and the long story short, the industry is not getting back to that anytime soon, if ever. Like, I think that was a bubble that was never going to be sustainable. All these services were desperate to build up as vast of a library as they could in a very short period of time. And, the end result of that was it didn't work. Like, these
Right.
other services, I mean, certainly they built subscriber bases, but they did not build levels of subscriber scale that was anywhere comparable to Netflix, which is what everybody's goal was in starting their own service. Like Disney, obviously, I think their thinking was, we pull all our content off of Netflix and we supplement it with, new Star Wars shows, new Marvel shows, and people will come to us in droves. And, they've done pretty well in terms of, they're the leader among the traditional media companies as far as, streaming users go, but they still have not been able to catch Netflix. And I think that the ingrained habit that consumers have had of going to Netflix first has kind of outweighed the content factor in some ways.
Right. So we can dig deeper into that too. Here we're seeing the amount of original series. It's going down for really every streamer that we're seeing here, though it's different levels in terms of what we're seeing for each streamer. So Disney, you brought up, it's pretty significant downturn in terms of titles that they're premiering on SVOD in the last year, especially on the Disney Plus specific platform. Hulu's pretty stable.
Yes. And, I think that some people might attribute that. It's easy to look at those numbers and be like, well, okay, they're not making as many Marvel shows. We've heard a lot about Marvel kind of pulling back on their content. They're not making as many Star Wars shows anymore. But that's only really part of the picture. Like Disney Plus was also built on exploiting the Disney library in a lot of ways for content to turn into, or IP content, I should say, to turn into streaming exclusive shows. They had like a Turner and Hooch show, a Mighty Ducks show, a National Treasure show, and a lot of those shows were canceled pretty quickly. Like they did not draw the kind of levels of viewership that I think Disney was hoping for. And they've also cut back on what you might call like general entertainment TV for the Disney Plus side of things. I think a lot of those dollars are shifting more towards Hulu because I think that they've seen it tends to pay off more on the Hulu side of things when you're making this generalized content that appeals more to adults than to like kids and adolescent audiences.
Right. So they're not doing that more expensive general content. Think something like Big Shot with John Stamos would be that like general content that was for the Disney Plus platform.
Yeah, that's a great example. Yeah, they've really pulled back on that in tandem with all these Star Wars and Marvel shows. So, I mean, Disney Plus really has seen, as you can see on the chart, a pretty steep pullback in original content going there. But at the same time, what they've done is they've integrated the Hulu content into the Disney Plus interface. Like you can, if you subscribe to the Disney bundle, you can go into Disney Plus and see Only Murders in the Building on there or The Bear on there, like these Hulu exclusive shows that are now available to be watched through Disney Plus.
Do you think that can maintain their subscriber base with less of that original franchise content on Disney Plus, which, whether it's those Disney franchises or the Star Wars, Marvel, all of that's being pulled back. And that was initially that was the value proposition, right? Was Star Wars and Marvel, new Star Wars and Marvel is here on Disney Plus. Star Wars is not in movie theaters anymore. It's on Disney Plus, which is still crazy, but
yeah, I mean, I think that it's tough to say. I do think that if you're a family with young kids, Disney Plus is still pretty essential for you. You want your kids to be able to watch Moana over and over again, or Inside Out 2, or, coming right up in theaters, Moana 2, which will end up on Disney Plus eventually. So I think that for a certain type of subscriber, Disney Plus is still very valuable. I think you might see, adult subscribers maybe start to move away from there. But the thing is, the Hulu and Disney Plus bundle is still a pretty good value proposition. You get a lot for that money. And I think that it's debatable whether Hulu is going to continue as a standalone service. I think that there's a lot of speculation that it might just be fully rolled up into Disney Plus eventually. I do think it benefits them to keep the Hulu branding alive because that's just an easy way to differentiate. Like, here's where the content for adults
but
lives.
That would be similar to what they do internationally, where right now within Disney Plus they've got Star on Disney Plus, which is where that adult Hulu content lives.
Yes, exactly right. Hulu has always been a U.S. only service, and internationally everything just lives on one platform, the way that they're only starting to do now in the U.S. market. But like I said, they can keep that tab alive. You can just go there and see like, oh, this is the Hulu content. So, as far as how it impacts their subscriber base, I think for now you might see people moving away from a standalone subscription to either service and more into the bundle space.
Right. So we've talked about things shifting and slowing down a little bit. Let's talk about something maybe a little more fun, upbeat, some hits. So what are the trends that we're seeing in terms of television hits for the first half of 2024?
Yeah, well, I mean, one thing you can't really ignore is IP-driven TV. The highest ranking series here you can see that's not on Netflix is Fallout on Prime Video, based on obviously the popular video game franchise. Reacher is in there, the Jack Reacher character. That's a character that's been, lived across multiple forms of media over time. That's another Prime Video show. The Avatar, The Last Airbender live action series on Netflix ranks pretty highly. Even something like Mr. and Mrs. Smith on Prime Video. I wouldn't necessarily think that the IP was, the number one thing drawing viewership to that show, but at least it's a title that people might recognize, be like, oh, I remember that. What is this? And then that, persuades them to check out the show, or at least helps the show to stand out among all the tiles of content that are on these streaming interfaces.
Right. And then taking it over to the film side, Netflix is really dominant. You see that on both charts, but 16 of the 20 shows here are Netflix titles. As far as other things we're seeing here, I think it's significant that Prime Video is holding that number one spot with Roadhouse.
Right. Yeah, I mean, I think part of the reason Netflix is so dominant here, I mean, obviously a big part of it is their subscriber scale, their unrivaled subscriber scale, but they, put out so much more content than anybody else, and they're still in the streaming exclusive movie business, which a lot of their competitors have exited.
Right.
A lot of the top performing movie titles on these services now are movies that have had theatrical rollouts, which are not accounted for here. So that's part of that. Roadhouse, I think that was a movie that people argued maybe should have gotten a theatrical rollout. I might agree with that. I mean, it's a title that people know. You had a star in it in Jake Gyllenhaal, so that could have performed probably decently well in theaters, but they chose to make it a streaming exclusive instead. And clearly that paid off in terms of, being able to claim the number one performing movie, SVOD original movie. But you can debate whether that, paid off for them in more financial respects. But certainly in terms of giving Prime Video bragging rights, that was something to talk about.
Which is it's still important these days, especially for something on
Yes.
Prime Video. As far as I think what's interesting here is the reliance, though, on some of these hits. Netflix has the biggest hit on television in the first half of the year, but it only accounts for 4% of the viewing time for originals on Netflix. A lot of these other streamers are much more reliant on their top content.
Right.
That makes things a little bit trickier for these other streamers, right, in terms of...
Yeah. I mean, like I said, Netflix puts out so much more content than everybody else. You could see back on the output chart, I think even in the first half of this year, which was a lower total for them, like probably their lowest total in several years, it was still something like 150 shows. So they are just massively outstripping their competitors in terms of the content volume that they're able to put out, which is a big part of why, their biggest hit still accounts for a relatively small percentage of the time spent with originals on the service. These other services are putting out fewer titles, therefore they're a bigger proportion of the time being spent on those titles is spent with the biggest hits.
Right. And Peacock's one of those that I just want to take a minute to talk about because I think their strategy is so interesting. It's interesting to see Days of Our Lives here on this chart. Days of Our Lives is now a streaming exclusive show. It's one of the biggest shows on Peacock. Obviously, part of that is it has a lot of minutes. It's daily.
Yes, lots of episodes there.
But Peacock's whole strategy is very interesting to me. They've got Days of Our Lives. They have a lot of Bravo content. They've got unscripted, like Love Island. And then they've got a lot of sports. They're bringing in... the NBA rights are coming.
Yeah.
Is that strategy something that's going to work for Peacock? They've struggled in terms of scripted and that piece of it.
Yeah. I mean, scripted has not been their strong suit. I get into this a bit in the report. I think even Ted, the show based on the Seth MacFarlane movie, that was their most watched original series by their own admission, and that still did not cross the threshold required to earn the success-based streaming residual bonus that is now built into the Writers Guild and SAG-AFTRA contracts. It had to reach a certain percentage of the subscriber base to get that.
And that even within the data, it benefited from a lead-in from an NFL playoff game. That was really which is interesting to see how they did that. But that was really advertised on that exclusive playoff game Peacock had, and you see the viewership really pop there, and then it dips.
Yeah, yeah. So obviously, again, scripted just has been kind of a struggle for them. I mean, Peacock has been doing better than you might think in other areas. I mean, in addition to the NFL, which you mentioned, they had their Olympics coverage this year, which was a big win for them. They presented all that content pretty well, like helping people kind of cut through the noise, figure out like what events they most wanted to watch, which ones were most interesting. Like they did a good job packaging all of that, which I think really paid off for them in terms of the influx of subscribers that they got for that. I think until they report their Q3 earnings, we're not going to know exactly what that looked like, but preliminary reports have been pretty good.
Yeah.
And I think that they have done well in terms of carving out an identity for themselves, which is really kind of the biggest challenge of the streaming era that we're in right now. Like, I think everybody is kind of competing for the same audiences in terms of like, we want to present something for everybody. Like that's really, Netflix's, kind of modus operandi has been like, we are going to be all things to all people. Like we're going to have something that interests everybody. And so their rivals have really kind of tried to imitate that approach. And that's been to mixed effect. I don't think that people could really tell you like, well, what's on Max? What does Max mean outside of HBO? Disney obviously has the Disney brand. That's a very trusted brand. So they've been able to kind of carve out like that family friendly identity for themselves. If you're a Max or a Paramount Plus, that's a lot tougher. And even like Apple TV Plus, I think a big part of their struggle is like, people don't necessarily understand like what am I getting for my money here outside of very specific titles like say Ted Lasso, So I think with Peacock, you're seeing like, okay, we have a lot of live sports, so we're the kind of the streaming destination for that. The Bravo content, like you mentioned, if you want to see NBC content, you can come to us. So I think that's one area where they have performed pretty strongly. How that impacts them financially, that's a little more of a mixed bag. I think their leadership has said that they're expecting losses on Peacock to peak actually this year, which is not going to be looked on too kindly from a Wall Street perspective. But, I think that in a couple of years, you might be surprised as to where Peacock ends up on the field of streaming players. I think it might look a little better for them than a lot of people would have assumed a couple years ago.
I think they have a really nice offering. I think it's something that I would bet on there as far as who's going to be around in the streaming landscape.
Yeah. And I mean, this is all, very anecdotal, but I feel like when I talk to, just people that I know who are kind of more, not in, the entertainment business space, they often talk quite complimentarily about Peacock. So
yes,
I
absolutely.
think that, if you're reading the vibe, it might come out pretty well for them.
Well, that's where we need to wrap things up, but thank you so much for joining. You can scan this QR code and sign up for our weekly Streaming Watch newsletter, where we'll have a lot more insights like this into streaming and what's going on with the whole streaming landscape. All the streaming consumption metrics here that you're seeing are from our streaming viewership tool that we have at Luminate. If you want to look more deeply into specific titles, things like that, please feel free to reach out to us. You can drop something in the chat, or you can reach out on our website, luminatedata.com.
Yep, and also I want to add that if you want more insights, not just on streaming, but across the media and tech business, you can check out Variety Intelligence Platform at variety.com/VIP for more insights like this.
Fantastic. Well, thanks so much, everyone, for joining. And please let us know if you have any questions. Thanks.
Thank you.